hear from and spend time with people who we would be most unlikely to be able to bring in person to Sudbury. So we're absolutely delighted to have Stan McKay with us tonight. I'm going to begin the evening with a land acknowledgement. I'm going to ask Stan to add his words after I have finished, and we would invite all of you to add your acknowledgement in the chat as you would wish, particularly if your territory has not been and treaty have not been mentioned. And I'd like to thank Lisa Blair, who is with us tonight, for these words. We begin our meeting by offering our gratitude for the lands we gather on. We acknowledge that these lands have been cared for and inhabited by many First Nations people from time immemorial to the present. We gather as a treaty people, Treaty 9, Robinson Superior, Robinson Huron, and Williams Treaty people. We acknowledge the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Algonquin, and Métis people who call these territories home. We give thanks for the current and historic contributions these and other Indigenous peoples continue to make in our region. May we all live in peace and friendship, honoring the treaties, seeking justice, and walking together in the spirit of reconciliation. Stan.
I bring greetings to you from Treaty 5 territory. We have moved recently to my home village in Fisher River on the west shore of Lake Winnipeg. And I bring you greetings and acknowledge as well the Anishinaabe nations that surround us and the many Métis people who inhabit this part of the province. Thank you.
Thank you. My co-host tonight is Faye Moffat, who many of you will know from her work as a church organist for many years and as a licensed lay worship leader and as a very active person in Cape Coral United Church and of course as a member of MILK. So I'm going to ask Faye to formally introduce Stan to you.
So welcome everyone to this workshop. What an honor it is to have Stan with us tonight. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Stan McKay, Very Reverend Stan McKay, former moderator of the United Church. He was our moderator from 1992 to 1994. I know that he's known to some of you, and perhaps some of you have been fortunate, as I have, to attend some of his presentations at a regional or a national conference of the United Church. He has been a tireless worker for opening up parts of history that we across this land and across this church simply did not know. And one of those historical perspectives allowed our church, or encouraged or urged our church, to change its symbol, its crest, a few years back to include the Indigenous people who were part of the United Church at the beginning of its origin. He attended Fisher River Indian Day School, Bertle Indian Residential School. He was a teacher before ordination and served in pastoral ministry in Norway House and Fisher River. He also has contributed over the years to the education of ministers in the United Church at the Dr. Jesse Soto Center, so that Indigenous students could study for the ministry in their own language. And more recently, he's been offering presentations and courses at the Center for Christian Studies. He has told stories at Peace Builder conferences, and he is presently working to build cross-cultural relations and participating in dialogue that address injustices stemming from our colonial history. Many of you locally will remember the 2017 film, Truly and Humbly, Memories of the First Apology, that was directed by Dr. Hoi Chu at Laurentian. And Stan had a big part in both working towards the apology and then also was featured in that movie. And in that film, Stan suggests that our relationships with each other and with creation are broken, and that non-Indigenous people have much to learn from Indigenous philosophies of life, tonight we look forward to hearing what you have to say to us about renewing the covenant and the Indigenous philosophies of life. So welcome, Stan.
Thank you so much. And I want to say hello to everyone who has joined us tonight. As we begin, I've been invited to share a prayer, and I've chosen to read for you a prayer written by Arthur Solomon, who was very much a presence in my life as I was learning about my own history and learning from Art about Indigenous justice and peacemaking. Art Solomon went to a World Council of Churches meeting, a special meeting held on the island of Mauritius in 1983. And he wrote this prayer for that gathering. Grandfather, look at our brokenness. Now we must put the sanctity of life as the most sacred principle of power and renounce the awesome might of materialism. We know that in all of creation, only the family of humans has strayed from the sacred way. We know that we are the ones who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to worship and walk in a sacred way. Then by affirmation, we may heal the earth and heal each other. Now we must affirm life for all that is living on the face of the earth, or there will be a final desecration with no reprieve. We hear the screams of those who die for want of food, and whose humanity is aborted and prevented. Grandfather, Sacred One, we know that unless we love and have compassion, the healing cannot come. Grandmother, teach us how to heal our brokenness. So with the thought of Arthur Solomon, I come before you and offer some simple thoughts for our consideration. I want to speak to you about my understanding of treaty as covenant. The numbered treaties in Western Canada were all negotiated or implemented very, very quickly. But there were many earlier treaties that are a part of the history of Canada. I want to tell you a story. But before I do that, I must tell you the concept of covenant is a biblical context. It comes from the stories in Genesis. And it speaks of, in Genesis 9, of God having Noah and his family in the covenant. And this is a quote. A covenant with all living beings, all birds and all animals. And Noah's faith was in this everlasting covenant with the Creator. All of creation is included in that first covenant. Later in biblical record, there's a second account of covenant, which has become very narrow. It forms the foundation of an understanding that God has chosen people as his children. And it's not inclusive. It's a group of people which will later become a nation state. It's a group of people that feel they are special in the eyes of God. And it makes no mention of the wholeness of creation being part of that covenant. So I wanted to share that with you as I speak of covenant and treaty as covenant, because I learned from an elder in the Coppell Valley in Saskatchewan. some years ago about the negotiations around Treaty Number 4. Treaty Number 4 happened in the Copel Valley when the commissioners of the treaty invited Indigenous leaders into the valley to negotiate the treaty. And I understand from the elders' oral history that many people came. Many leaders came into the valley for that gathering. One of their first questions when they encountered the treaty commissioner was, what about our cousins? What about the Métis people, our cousins who are with us? And the response from the treaty commissioner was, no, they're not included in this process. So they cannot be a part of this conversation. There was further clarification that day. And then the people disappeared. The Indigenous leaders disappeared. They went away. And of course, as the days went by, the Treaty Commission was very concerned. They thought maybe they had no further opportunity to negotiate Treaty 4. What had happened was the leaders had determined that if they were going to talk about the land and life together on the land, they had to go away for ceremony. So the elder told me that they had gone away for 4 days of ceremony. And he didn't give me any details, but I expect that they went to the sweat lodge. Some of them may have fasted. All of them would have prayed. And for 4 days, they would prepare themselves for this important discussion about treaty. They came back into the village and they sat down with the treaty commissioner and the treaty party and talked about Treaty 4. They came to an understanding after some discussion and they signed the treaty. They understood the treaty was a covenant. It was not between them and the treaty commissioner. It included the creator, the treaty commissioner, and the Indigenous peoples. It was a tripartite arrangement in their understanding, because you don't talk about sacred things like the earth and about sharing life without having time in prayer and preparation. So when they had put their names to the treaty, the foundational statement in the treaties was that this covenant would be in place as long as the sun shines, as long as the grass grows, and as long as the river flows. So this covenant making was not about a simple sharing of real estate. The phrase that comes forward out of the treaty negotiations across the prairies is that we will share life in a good way. And that is what I would call a covenant. The total misunderstanding of covenant and of treaty making as a real estate arrangement, of course, is Canada's history. The history in Canada is based on the idea that somehow the land was given up. And much of the effort of governments over the years has been to extinguish the ongoing relationship of treaty making. The understanding and the interests of the treaty commissioners, the treaty party, was to bring a settlement of disputes about land. Now that, of course, continues until today. Within the federal government's employ are many, many lawyers who continue to defend the idea that the treaties were a land arrangement. So I wanted to share with you tonight my understanding from talking with elders, from speaking with people here in my own village. The understanding is the treaty does not end. And you, my friends, are all treaty people. You are all treaty people because you too are engaged in the results of the negotiations for treaty relationship. So we are in covenant together. And when I go to a funeral in a village in Saskatchewan where one of my friends died tragically some years ago, I go into the village and the people are gathered, and the elder who is presiding says, my relatives, it's good that you have come, that we can be together to comfort each other and be a comfort to the family who are grieving. And so I say to you, my relatives, it's good that we are together tonight to at least ponder what our relationship in Canada is. How do we understand each other? How do we respect each other? How do we live together in a good way on the land? I mentioned the earliest mention of covenant in Genesis included all the animals and all of life on the earth. In my adult life, I learned about prayer, and it helps me now to understand covenant. When we go into the lodge for prayer in the traditional way, in a ceremony of prayer, we begin by acknowledging all life on the earth, things created as a part of our human existence. We acknowledge the two-legged, the four-legged, the ones that fly, the ones that swim. We acknowledge all of creation, the plant life, the trees, the waters, the air, and we acknowledge that we are interdependent. We are related to each other. Now that kind of prayer is about covenant. And when we come out of the lodge on our hands and knees after prayer, we come out of the lodge and say, Kachinau in Wako Maganak. In my language, that means all of my relations, all of my relatives. We acknowledge the creation and all of the people with whom we share life. So I think that approach to understanding life shared in Canada is an important understanding. And the reason it is so important is that the lands set aside in treaty by the surveyors sent by government out to survey treaty territories. In Canada, the last article I read, treaty lands make up 0.02% of Canada's landmass. 0.02%. Which means we have a tiny fraction of the earth that is designated for us as our homeland. Now that's totally unrealistic. We are a people of hunting, gathering. Our life is on the land, and we need to be in covenant with all of creation and with all of our neighbors. And we are intending still to capture the spirit and intent of the treaty. The spirit of the treaty is that we are relatives. The spirit of the treaty is that we must share. And all that is biblical around love and relationship and care, all of that is included in my understanding of the treaty. Not just the treaty here, but the treaties across the land that were made with an intent to share life in a good way. And so when I offer this vision of treaty, I offer it because I believe that people of faith, people of good heart, people of prayer, people who recognize their place on the land can come to a place of renewal of what it is to share land. Recently, I was at the um, Sandy Soto Spiritual Center, which was where I worked for a number of years. It was the Dr. Jesse Soto Center, but it is amalgamated with the church, the school from Ontario, from Five Oaks, and has now become the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center. I was there for a learning circle a few years ago, and an elder who lives up in James Bay offered this thought. We do not own the land. We do not own the land. We belong to the land. We belong to the land. And so that fits very, very well into the covenant concept. The idea of fee simple, of land ownership, is a global problem. A global problem, because only the very wealthy can afford to own land under the market value systems. And we live in a time when I think the concept, the spirit and intent of treaty making needs to impact what we call the real estate world within a global context. So I wanted to leave this with you. I wanted to leave time. I'm not sure how long I've gone on, but I want to leave time now for us to have some conversation about what I've been sharing and what little I understand about treaty and how I am a treaty person. And my understanding is that you too are treaty people, because the covenant was inclusive from our perspective of all peoples. Shared with you, but I want to take an approach that I've learned from people like Arthur Solomon and people of that generation, elders who taught me. And it is about a philosophy of life that I call the Indigenous circle of life. And I will go fairly slowly because I want you to have an image in your mind of a circle. So as I speak, you can draw that in your mind. The eastern door of the lodge. The eastern door, which is usually the door among the Anishinaabe, is the door you enter when you enter the lodge. The eastern door is described as the birthing door, the beginning of life, the rising of the sun. So the eastern door of the lodge is about childhood, about birthing. And the women are the ones who bring new life to the earth. So women are honored in the eastern door, and the birth of children. The children come into the world totally dependent on others for life. The children need to be fed. They need to be kept warm. They need to be loved. They need to be nurtured in every way. If they are going to survive, they must have care and love. That's how we all begin, all of us. We begin life in the eastern door, dependent, totally dependent. But those of you who have had children in your home or have watched children, you will learn that they soon, after birth, begin to crawl a bit, and then they learn to stand and they start making noise. Eventually they start to say a few words. And one of the first words they will say to you is, you know, what do they say first? No. No. And the first few times they will say it, they're not sure what they're saying. They're not quite sure. They know, and they know they have some rights, And so when you tell them to do something and they're not sure about it, they will say no. And after a few times, it'll be louder and stronger. And they will say no. Well, that continues over the next number of years. And it's very trying for parents at times. And by the time they're 14 or 15, they are saying, definitely not. No way. You see the progress. They're moving from the eastern door towards the southern door in the circle. And they're learning independence. Independence. And by the time they're teenagers, they are very much about independence. They want to have their own way. They want to declare their own person. They want to be more in control. So independence is a natural and important development. And at the southern door, it's established. From the southern door, as they move towards the western door in their journey of life, each of us begin to have experiences. We join friends, we become involved with a person, and maybe we have a partner in life. Maybe we have some children. Now, independence isn't all that simple. Independence has become complicated, and we're now sharing decisions. And we're learning how to be together. Sometimes as families, sometimes as communities, we're learning to be together. And by the time we arrive at the western door, we know that our responsibility is to care for the ones who are being born and for the ones who are trying out their independence. We're caring for those people. And we're also caring for people who are at the northern door. Because as you move around the circle to the northern door, you come to the place where the elders are. The elders are. And in many communities, they're saying, well, these are the knowledge keepers, or these are the wise ones in our community, because they know about life. And they are confirming in their door in the north that interdependence is the way of life. They keep the stories, they teach the ceremonies, they do the naming, they are guiding the community. Whenever the community needs help, they go to the northern door and they learn about interdependence, about problem solving, and about how we're related to each other and how life might be. So we can see the journey. Total dependence, independence, gradually to interdependence. And the elders in the northern door confirm that understanding. So I think this development is not always natural, this circle of life. Because you will note, if you look south of us to the southern border of Canada, just over the border, they have a declaration of independence. Their founding statement is a declaration of independence. Now, Crees, who have a sense of humor, would say that's pretty immature to declare independence. We've been taught by our elders that we move on to interdependence. So our philosophy of life is that this is a journey, a circle. I want to tell you another part of that story that I've observed. When my grandfather was living alone here in the village, we were living in a larger house with our family. My grandmother had died. And as my grandfather was aging, he didn't have much experience, with working in the kitchen. My grandmother had done all of that. And so he had become, in some ways, reliant on her for care. So after a few months of being on his own, he was not doing very well. We invited him to our house to be with us. He came to live with us. And we discovered what was happening. My grandfather had gone from dependence, independence, interdependence, and now in the late stage of his life, he was coming back to the Eastern door, to dependence. He was no longer able to do all of the things for himself that he would have liked. His health was not as good, and so he needed people to care for him, to feed him, to give him care, support him, nurture him. And the circle of life was coming to completion. When he was 82 and living with us, our youngest daughter was 2 years old. She was 2. And when he was staying with us, he had his own room, and often in the afternoon, they would take naps together. She was moving towards independence, and he was coming to the place of dependence. And they spent time together. And in the evenings, on a nice summer evening, they'd go out into the yard and they'd walk around together, holding hands. He was telling her about independence, interdependence. And she was on her journey of life, learning from him. So I think that all of us can benefit from a philosophy, a self-understanding, a learning from our community, from the ways of life around us, about how we move through our stages of life, and how there is dignity and respect for all of these stages of life as we experience them. I want to tell you this lesson because it came to me as a very important understanding for myself. And I will tell you that an interruption in my own life was my time in residential school. I was taken away from family and spent 5 years in a school. And those were very lonely, isolating years. And I was at an age where I should have been moving towards independence, but that wasn't permitted in the school. The school was there to give you rules and regulations and guide how you dressed, what you ate, and all of your life was directed. So I never really had an opportunity to move smoothly through life with any rebellion or any kind of testing of what my independence could be. So the trauma of that experience for me meant almost 17 years of not coming home. 17 years to find myself because my journey through the circle of life had been interrupted. But you know, I came through that with friends, with family. I came through that. I finally gained some confidence. And with people like you, I found a way to be in community. And I find that the circle of life is real. And we in our society have done many things to break that cycle. But I think as long as we imagine it, as long as we encourage it, it can continue as a natural way of developing community and caring for one another. So I could say much more about reference to the land and how interdependence involves creation. Our ecological crisis that we live with now is largely due to the fact that from creation we just take and take much more than we need. We take and we destroy. We live in a region now in Manitoba here where the moose population has been devastated. There's been overhunting. The teaching of taking only what you need about interdependence has been forgotten. And now we have very few moose left in a vast area of Manitoba. Ecologically, We destroy the earth, the water, the air, because we think we can gain some wealth from resources in creation. And somehow, irresponsibly, we're being called into question by young people, people who would go by names like Greta, who say to us, you are failing us as adults, you're failing us because you're not acknowledging the full meaning of interdependence. I want to end this by saying that the Paris Accord has been celebrated by many. The Paris Agreement on the environment. I'm not very excited by it because I think it has missed the key element. The Paris Accord is about ecological management. I'm not talking about ecological management, about 25% or 30%, or that doesn't work in my understanding, my philosophy of life that I learned from the Indigenous community. I think my father, as a hunter, trapper, fisher, would say to me, you only take what you need. You only take what you need. And our world has moved far beyond that. We have been disrespectful of creation. We have not acknowledged interdependence is beyond the human community. It's about the whole creation. And I think that is part of the gospel as I've understood it. The gospel, the good life, the good news is about the potential for shared life, justice, and equity, and love for all. It's obvious I could go on, but I want to stop for a moment and have your stories and your thoughts as a part of this evening. Thank you.
Dan, for being with us tonight, for sharing your wisdom, for challenging us to mature into interdependency, to find ways to share in a good way with each other and with the land, and for assuring us that we can all do something to encourage love and respect and to celebrate diversity, and for reminding us of the importance of joy and laughter. You mentioned that we need to move beyond land acknowledgements to into some sort of action. And I want to share with everyone who's here with us this evening that when you and I first spoke about this event, I asked about an honorarium, and you challenged us by saying that you did not want an honorarium for being with us tonight, but you wanted us to do something. And the something that you asked us to do was to prepare some event to be held at the Cairn on National Indigenous Peoples Day to celebrate the resilience of Indigenous people and to think about ways in which we can move forward to create more meaningful, more healed relationships. And we haven't firmed up exactly what that is going to look like yet, but we make a commitment that we are going to do that in your honor and in the honor of, to honor our attempts to create better relationships and to be a part of the healing process. We anticipate that there may be some difficulties still by June in a large gathering, so we are looking at other ways of enabling people to fulfill your request and to take that time to think about what we as individuals and as part of faith communities can commit to doing going forward to live out the wisdom that you have shared with us in our lives beyond this event tonight. So thank you for your presentation tonight. Thank you for the challenge to create a meaningful event at the Cairn. We will certainly be in touch with you about that and let you know how that is moving forward. And of course, I invite everyone who is able to be in Sudbury to visit the cairn, to think about how you can participate in reconciliation and renewal of relationships by making a pilgrimage perhaps to the cairn on that, particularly on that day, or possibly the Sunday before. So we thank you very much for your time here with us tonight, and we look forward to letting you know how we can move forward, and we will leave tonight pondering our next steps, working out how we can, as individuals and as communities, honor the fact that we are treaty people and that we are all related. So thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Faye, for hosting. Thank you, Natasha, for doing the technical things and getting us all together tonight. And I thank you once again for your words of wisdom.